The heat of the savannah air hung heavy with a sweet, almost intoxicating scent of jasmine, carried by the gentle sea breeze that slipped through the tree-lined streets. The city's cobblestone roads gleamed under the golden hue of the setting sun, casting long shadows beneath the age-old oaks that lined the downtown. In this moment, everything seemed to breathe with a soft, languid pace, as if time itself had slowed down for just a breath. It was the kind of day that invited tourists to pause and snap a photo, while longtime residents lingered a little longer on their porches, savoring the comfort of home. David Langston stepped out of his Tesla Model S, adjusting the cuffs of his perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit, the fabric smooth under his fingertips. He caught a brief glimpse of his reflection in the car's polished surface. Tall, composed, a man who wore his confidence like a second skin. In his late 40s, his hair cropped close, every movement deliberate. He exuded an air of quiet authority. His briefcase clicked softly in his hand as he retrieved it from the back seat, his fingers brushing the small yarn charm Alicia had tucked inside before he left, a good luck token, woven with love by his daughter. He smiled briefly at the thought, the small gesture grounding him for the day ahead. The courthouse loomed before him, a towering neoclassical structure of stone, standing stoic and unyielding in the fading light. Its columns seemed to stare down at him like silent sentinels, indifferent to the lives it had witnessed, the battles fought within its walls. He'd argued countless cases here, his name already etched into the history of this place, but today felt different. It wasn't the legal complexity of the case he was walking into, or the high stakes of the trial. No, it was a subtle feeling, gnawing at him, a foreboding sensation that lodged deep in his gut. Something didn't feel right. He shook it off quickly, unable to waste time on premonitions. He had a case to win. He had a job to do. Across the street, the engine of a black and white patrol car rumbled softly, its headlights flickering faintly in the twilight. Officer Jason Rohr, sitting behind the wheel with his arms crossed over his vest, scanned the scene with a keen, almost predatory focus. His eyes, hard as steel, darted over every face, every movement, looking for the next sign of trouble. His partner, Officer Eli Matthews, sat beside him, slouched and weary, the weight of years of chasing shadows hanging heavily on his shoulders. He sighed, glancing out the window, but his gaze lingered more on the courthouse steps than on the bustling street. The tension in the air felt thick, as if the very city was holding its breath. Roar's gaze locked onto David as he approached, a tall figure in a well-tailored suit, the sleek Tesla parked just ahead, a man who clearly didn't belong on Roar's mental radar of potential suspects. Yet, something about him made Roar's pulse quicken, a faint echo of an earlier radio call that had described a black male, around 40, seen near a string of burglaries in the downtown area. The description was vague, a scatter of details that could have applied to half a dozen people in this neighborhood, but Roar didn't care. The instinct was there, and he was determined to act on it. "See that guy?" Roar asked, his finger tapping the window, his voice a low growl. Matthews followed the direction of his gaze, squinting slightly. He exhaled, clearly uninterested. "So, that could be half the attorneys in this town." Roar didn't listen. His mind was already made up. "I'm checking it out," he said, his voice sharp with intent. Before Matthews could protest, Roar was out of the car, adjusting his belt as he crossed the street, his footsteps deliberate and quick, the kind that spoke of a man who had long ago stopped questioning his own instincts. David didn't notice Roar approaching until the officer's voice sliced through the air, sharp and commanding. "Sir, step away from the vehicle now." David's head snapped around in confusion, his brows furrowing as he tried to make sense of the sudden confrontation. David's confusion deepened as the officer's demand rang out, an edge of authority in his voice that felt strangely out of place. His body tensed, but he kept his movements slow and deliberate, his mind racing to catch up with the surreal situation unfolding before him. "I'm sorry, officer," David began, his tone calm, still uncertain of the nature of the problem. "Is there an issue here?" He stood still, trying to make sense of it, his hand instinctively brushing the fabric of his suit, feeling for the yarn charm inside his briefcase. "Hands where I can see them!" Officer Rohr barked, stepping closer. The command sent a ripple of tension through David's chest, but he didn't move. The crowd around them began to grow, drawn by the shift in the air, sensing something was wrong. Some pedestrians slowed their pace, eyes flicking nervously between the officers and David, a murmur running through the few who had stopped to watch. David's gaze flickered briefly to the courthouse steps, his mind processing the surreal contrast of what was happening outside the very building where he had fought for justice countless times before. I said, "Step away from the vehicle," Rohr repeated, his voice low but firm. David stood tall, but a knot twisted in his stomach. "Suspect in what exactly?" he asked, keeping his voice steady, despite the rising discomfort. The officer didn't answer. Instead, Rohr stepped forward, reaching for the cuffs on his belt. His hands moved with practiced precision, as if arresting someone was routine, as if David was just another black man to fit a description. "I'm a federal prosecutor," David said, his words clear but measured. "I'm on my way into court." "Then you won't mind answering a few questions," Rohr sneered, his hand already on David's wrist, pulling it behind his back with an iron grip. The cold steel of the cuffs snapped shut with a chilling finality. David's briefcase hit the ground with a heavy thud, the small yarn loop from Alicia's good luck charm slipping free from its pocket, tumbling softly onto the sidewalk. David stood motionless, staring at Rohr with a calm intensity, his eyes unwavering. "You're making a mistake," he said firmly, his voice steady as ever. The officer didn't answer. He just pushed David toward the squad car, and the crowd continued to watch in stunned silence. Inside the courthouse, Judge Naomi Brenner was already reviewing dockets when a flicker of motion caught her eye through the window. She glanced up, her brow furrowing at the commotion outside. There, just past the looming columns of the courthouse, she saw a man being shoved into the back of a patrol car. Something about him seemed familiar, but she couldn't place it. The low buzz of conversation in the room stilled as her gaze lingered on the unfolding scene. Phones clicked to life, capturing every moment, and the quiet murmurs of the growing crowd began to swell. "What the hell? That guy was in a suit," a young woman whispered to her companion, disbelief in her voice. "What did he do? Blink wrong?" The words hung in the air like smoke, and it wasn't long before the growing hum of confusion and anger began to fill the space. Another routine stop, another unjust arrest, another headline waiting to be written. But this time, it was different. The man in the back of that squad car wasn't just anyone. David Langston sat still in the back seat of the patrol car, his eyes fixed straight ahead, calm and calculated. The world outside blurred as the car made its way down East Liberty Street, weaving through the sluggish traffic. David's mind was far from the street, far from the officers who'd made this unjust decision. Instead, it was focused, laser sharp, on the legal battle that was about to unfold. He had spent his life in courtrooms, dissecting cases like this one, but this time, he was the one in the hot seat, the one about to rewrite the rules. He didn't panic. He didn't shout. He didn't struggle. He simply breathed, every second of the ordeal weighing in his mind like a stack of evidence. Officer Rohr glanced nervously in the rearview mirror, his hand tightening on the wheel. "You're quiet," he muttered, as if expecting an answer. But David remained silent, his mind already shifting gears. This wasn't just a mistake. It was the start of something bigger. A battle for truth, a confrontation between power and prejudice, and it was only just beginning. The silence in the car felt suffocating, but David welcomed it. He was no longer just a prosecutor. He was now a symbol, a force that was about to make its mark. The squad car rumbled slowly down East Liberty Street, its tires grinding over the uneven pavement, moving with deliberate, almost mocking slowness. Inside, David Langston sat upright, his hands cuffed behind him, the rough edges of the seat biting into his shoulder blades. The metal cuffs pressed painfully into his wrists, but he didn't flinch. His fingers flexed lightly, testing the limits of the cold steel, not out of any desire to resist, but to remind himself that he was still in control. At least of himself. The world outside the window was a blur, but inside his mind, every detail of this moment was sharp, clear, an unfolding case, a stack of evidence that was only getting thicker with each passing second. Officer Rohr kept glancing in the rearview mirror, his eyes flicking back and forth like he expected David to finally speak, to break the silence. "You're quiet," he muttered again, his voice carrying a note of expectation. But David remained silent, his gaze locked straight ahead. He had learned long ago that silence could be a weapon just as much as words could. This moment wasn't one for shouting or pleading. This was the moment before a storm, the calm before the undeniable truth would be unleashed. "I've seen a lot of guys like you," Roar continued, his voice heavy with that familiar undercurrent of condescension. "Think a fancy car and a nice suit makes you untouchable." David's eyes briefly flicked to the rearview mirror, meeting Roar's gaze for the first time. The words came slowly, measured, cutting through the officer's bravado. "But the Constitution is supposed to mean something," Roar scoffed, tightening his grip on the wheel. The sound of tires on asphalt filled the small space, but David's words seemed to hang in the air, refusing to dissipate. Officer Matthews, who had remained silent for most of the ride, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting between Roar and David. He had been quiet, unsure, but even now, the silence in the car was becoming unbearable. David didn't look away, his stare unwavering. He knew that the fight wasn't over. It had just begun. The system that had wronged him was about to be tested in ways it hadn't been before. The cold steel on his wrists, the weight of the situation. It didn't intimidate him. It only solidified his resolve. The squad car cruised toward the courthouse, its engine a low hum against the tense silence inside. As they neared, David caught a brief glimpse of the federal seal on the side of the building, the same place where just hours ago he had walked with purpose, confident and unbothered. Now, with his hands cuffed behind him and his mind racing, the irony of the moment hit him like a punch to the gut. His feet carried him to the very building that had seen him argue countless cases. Only this time, he wasn't entering as a prosecutor. He was entering as a suspect, cuffed like a criminal. The car slowed as it turned into the sally port, the concrete walls of the courthouse looming above them, indifferent and unyielding. Officer Roar, tense and unrelenting, yanked open the back door with a sharp motion. David moved slowly, deliberately, as if every step was being measured. Not by defiance, but by the dignity he refused to let them strip away. His posture remained straight as he emerged from the car, the rough scrape of the handcuffs against his wrists echoing louder than the footsteps of the officers who flanked him. Inside, the scene was one of muted confusion. Two federal marshals stood by the security checkpoint, chatting casually, until they saw David. Torres, the younger marshal, raised an eyebrow in recognition. "Mr. Langston?" he asked, his voice betraying a flicker of surprise. Before Roar could speak, David answered, "Yes. Can you please call Judge Brainerd?" Roar brushed past, ignoring the questioning glance from Torres. He was too eager to follow his own narrative, too convinced that his actions had been justified. The elevator doors closed behind them, and David stood in silence, not looking at the two officers beside him, but instead focusing on the quiet clatter of the elevator as it ascended. The weight of his situation pressed in on him, but he held his ground. This wasn't just about an arrest. It was the beginning of something bigger, something that would force the system to face itself. When the elevator doors finally opened on the third floor, the game had changed. David was no longer just a prosecutor in his suit. He was the living proof of a broken system, and the reckoning was about to begin. The elevator doors opened with a soft ding, and the tension in the air seemed to thicken. David stepped out into the sterile hallway, his footsteps echoing off the polished marble floors. He stood tall, despite the cuffs around his wrists, as if the weight of the injustice pressed down on everyone but him. His mind was already spinning, calculating, preparing for the battle ahead. Officer Roar and Matthews followed behind him, their presence a heavy, unwelcome reminder of the prejudice they had enacted. As they approached the security checkpoint, two federal marshals stood by, chatting casually. They paused when they saw David, and Torres, the younger of the two, raised an eyebrow in surprise. His eyes flickered from the cuffs to David's face, but it wasn't recognition that stopped him. It was a sudden understanding of the absurdity of the situation. "Mr. Langston?" Torres asked, his voice uncertain, but tinged with respect. Before Roar could answer, David turned toward the marshal, his voice calm but firm. "Yes, can you please call Judge Brainerd?" The words hung in the air, weighted with meaning. Roar ignored the exchange and marched past them, his eyes locked on the ground as if the reality of the moment didn't faze him. David didn't look at him. Instead, he focused on the impending confrontation with the system that was about to unfold. The officers didn't understand yet. They were too consumed by their own prejudices to realize that this moment, this wrong, was about to change everything. They moved down the hallway, the sound of their steps muffled by the thick carpeting beneath them. The atmosphere felt like a slow-moving storm, a quiet before the eruption of truth. David's heart beat steady, though the world around him was anything but. At the end of the corridor, the door to Judge Naomi Brenner's chambers swung open, and her commanding presence filled the space. She stepped forward, her gaze sharp, fixed on David with a quiet understanding of the gravity of the moment. "Take the cuffs off," she ordered, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. Roar hesitated for a moment, but at the judge's command, he finally unclipped the cold metal, the sound echoing louder than it should. David rubbed his wrists, the metal's tight grip now gone, and looked at Judge Brenner. She didn't need to say more. The next part of this battle was already in motion. The air was thick with the certainty that something much larger than an arrest was about to unfold. The courtroom was already humming with whispers when David Langston took his seat at the defense table, not where he usually sat, not where he was supposed to be. The air was thick with tension, the murmurs of the gallery growing louder as people took their places. It wasn't just a trial anymore. It was an event, a reckoning, the kind that would make its mark on this city and beyond. David adjusted his tie, smoothing his lapel, the simple act grounding him in the chaos swirling around him. No briefcase rested by his side, just silence. His eyes scanned the room, meeting the gazes of curious law clerks, junior attorneys, and even a few senior DOJ officials who had quietly slipped in, eager to see what would unfold. Across the aisle stood Officer Jason Rohr, arms folded, jaw clenched, his expression a mixture of defiance and frustration. It was clear that he hadn't expected things to go this far, but there was no regret in his posture, only stubbornness. Beside him, Officer Eli Matthews slouched, his eyes flickering nervously between the growing crowd and his partner, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to speak up. He had stayed silent when it mattered, but now, with the spotlight on him, his discomfort was evident. He shifted uneasily, his foot tapping softly against the floor, a sign that the weight of the situation was finally sinking in. The room grew still as Judge Naomi Brenner entered, her robes sweeping behind her like a storm gathering. She wasted no time, her sharp gaze cutting through the tension in the room. "This session is being held on the record at the request of Mr. David Langston, Assistant United States Attorney for the Southern District of Georgia," she began, her voice unwavering, each word laced with steel. "This is not a trial, but it may become one." David stood slowly, his movements deliberate, the microphone in front of him buzzing faintly. He took a deep breath and began to speak, not with anger, but with the kind of clarity that cut through the noise. His voice echoed through the room as he laid bare the truth of what had happened to him. He wasn't just a man arrested without cause. He was a man subjected to a system that had failed him and countless others. "I was arrested without cause, without probable cause, and without even the courtesy of a conversation," David said, his words sharp, his gaze steady. "I was told I fit a vague description, one that could have applied to hundreds of men in this city." The silence that followed was heavy, laden with the weight of his truth. David turned to face Rohr, his voice low but piercing. "You didn't see a prosecutor, Officer Rohr. You saw a profile, a black man near a luxury vehicle. That's all it took." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and for the first time, Rohr's expression faltered, his defiance cracking under the weight of David's unwavering truth. Judge Brayner's voice cut through the silence. "Mr. Langston, I will allow this line of argument for now," she said, her words final. "Thank you." David sat back down, his heart pounding, but his hands steady. He had spoken his truth, and now the battle was no longer just his. It was everyone's. The reckoning had only just begun. Days passed, and the world outside David Langston's quiet home spun faster with every passing hour. His arrest had already gone viral, sparking an outpouring of debates, headlines, and opinions. The video of him being cuffed in front of the courthouse had traveled across the nation, a symbol of an unjust system, a stark reminder that racial profiling wasn't just a talking point, it was a lived reality. As the news cycle churned, David received a call from Senator Maya Hill, who had seen the firestorm his story had ignited. "I need you to come in today," she said, her voice urgent but steady. "We're holding a press conference. You don't have to speak if you're not ready, but we need you there." David's heart beat a little faster as he hung up the phone. It wasn't just about him anymore. It wasn't just about a prosecutor's wrongful arrest. His story had become the face of something much larger, something that couldn't be ignored. A reckoning had begun, and it wasn't slowing down. The press room at the DOJ's local office was packed. Reporters jostled for position, their cameras flashing, their pens moving like frantic scribbles as the weight of the moment settled in. David stood at the podium in the same suit he had worn the day before, no tie this time, just his name and his words. He was ready. He had to be. The room fell silent as he began to speak. His voice, calm but unwavering, carried over the murmurs, cutting through the noise. "My name is David Langston. I am a federal prosecutor. I've spent 20 years fighting for truth, due process, and the dignity of the law. Yesterday, I was handcuffed without question, without probable cause, and without even the courtesy of a conversation." The room was still, save for the sound of cameras clicking and pens scribbling furiously. David's words hung in the air, heavy and real, as his story became not just his, but every black person who had ever been unfairly judged, every son who had been told to stay silent just to survive. "If I didn't have a badge in my wallet, I wouldn't be standing here," he said softly. "I'd be in a holding cell, or worse." The room was silent for a beat before the murmurs started again, this time filled with awe, disbelief, and for the first time in a long time, hope. David Langston had stepped into the light, not just as a man wronged, but as a voice demanding change. The day after the press conference, the world had changed. What started as one man's fight for justice had morphed into a national movement, and the pressure was mounting on every level. David Langston's story was everywhere, on news broadcasts, trending on social media, discussed in homes across the country. It was no longer just about racial profiling or one wrongful arrest. It had become about the systemic failures that had allowed such injustices to continue unchecked, about the deep-seated prejudice that ran through the very institutions meant to uphold the law. In the quiet of his office, David sat alone, the weight of everything pressing down on him. His phone buzzed relentlessly. Calls from colleagues, friends, civil rights activists, even strangers who were now following his every move. But it was an encrypted message that caught his attention. A whistleblower, someone from within the police department, had come forward. The message was brief, cryptic, but urgent. "You're not the first, but you might be the last." The name attached to the message was Eli Matthews, the officer who had silently witnessed David's arrest and the subsequent corruption. David felt a rush of disbelief. He knew Matthews, had even defended him years ago when Matthews had been falsely accused of a petty crime. The idea that Matthews, the man who had stayed quiet for so long, was now the one willing to expose the truth, sent a cold thrill down David's spine. It was more than just evidence. It was a confession. Matthews had seen the lies, the manipulation, and now he was ready to tear it all down. The following morning, David met with Matthews in secret, away from the cameras, away from the noise. Matthews handed over a folder thick with internal memos, emails, and a spreadsheet containing names. 32 black men, all flagged by Officer Jason Rohr for no reason other than their skin color. No charges, no investigations, just profiles, ignored and buried. Matthews's face was drawn, guilt etched into his features. "I've been saving this," he confessed, his voice quiet but resolute. "I couldn't stay silent anymore." David took the folder, his hands trembling not with fear, but with the power of what he now held. The final pieces of the puzzle had fallen into place. This wasn't just about a broken system. It was about an entire city, an entire country, built on the backs of those who had been silenced for too long. The fight had just begun, but now David Langston had the match that would ignite the fire of change.